From Amsterdam, this is Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute, a treasure trove of the best and the brightest of American thinking. I'm Jonathan Grubert, and this week's guest is one of the great novelists and classicists of our age, the best-selling novelist Donna Tartt. Here she is having a great time answering questions back in 1993. Questions like, who are your heroes? Charles Dickens?
Yeah, he is. He's very nice. He's very grandfatherly. He's like, okay, good try. Try again. Not like Joyce, who just...
No. Or T.S. Eliot, for that.
Or T.S. Eliot, I know, who just strike one dumb for the rest of one's life.
So that's the reason why you put him on your answering machine.
And it works. It works. They hang up. They don't call back.
A very young-sounding Donna Tartt from this super fun conversation recorded way back on March 14th, 1993. The Southern author gave a reading and answered questions for the John Adams, hot on the heels of her hit book, The Secret History. It was the book to have that year. And The Secret History tells the tale of a close-knit group of 6 students at an elite college who hatch a plan to stage a Greek bacchanal. A plan that ultimately leads to a death. I actually met Ms. Tartt a few years ago when she was touring the Netherlands supporting her novel, The Goldfinch. A lot of that book was set in Amsterdam, and The Goldfinch itself became a bestseller, a Hollywood film, won a Pulitzer, and was a New York Times Book Review Book of the Year. Not bad, right? But back in 1993, her excitement as a newly minted celebrity was palpable as she flexed her encyclopedic literary knowledge and great wit and discussed her heroes like Faulkner, unavoidable if you're from Mississippi, which she is, and Edgar Allan Poe. And it probably helps to thumb through your copy of The Secret History for this interview, by the way. And now, with no further ado, here's Donna Tartt in conversation with the Dutch journalist, author, and literary critic, Peter Steins.
In The Secret History, you write about the strange cold breadth of the ancient world and about the classical mind, which is narrow, unhesitating, relentless. Are the classics, is Greek culture dangerous to fragile minds?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't particularly think so, but the opening epigram of my book, this quote by Nietzsche. I inquire now as to the genesis of a philologist and assert the following. A young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are. He does not know whether he is suited for finding out about them. And we all know how poor Nietzsche turned out, what happened to him.
The Secret History is a novel about good and evil, about how seductive evil can be, how lives are ruined by crime. It's a very moralist theme, you could say. Would you call yourself a moralistic writer?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, just the novel, just the form I've chosen, the novel is, though it is a popular art form, but it's also a very, very moral art form in a lot of ways. I mean, our greatest novels are about sort of depict, Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina. I mean, these are all about the workings out of moral problems in the real. And I think the reason that novels appeal to us so much is that no matter how much philosophy or we've studied or how religious we are, we can't really assimilate. I think it's very difficult to assimilate these ideas, into our blood, into our daily lives. I mean, whereas something like, if we read it, if we see it dramatized, we understand it so much better. Jesus, in the Bible, whenever he can't get people to, the disciples never understand anything before Jesus tries to tell them. And he always says, he tries to explain, they don't understand. He says, well, let me tell you a story. And this is what he does again and again, parables. And we understand things. Buddhism, the story of the burning house, this is a parable that Buddha told, I think, in the fire sermon. But there's some little children that are in a house and their mother's going to town, and while she's gone, the house catches on fire and the little kids are all trapped in the house. And she goes outside, she comes back and she sees her kids in this burning house, and so she does everything to try to get them to come out because they're little and they're scared and they don't know what to do. And she tries reasoning with them, that doesn't work, they're panic-stricken. She tries yelling at them, threatening them. they're still panic-stricken. And then she has a brilliant idea. She's been to town, and she reaches in her bag, and she pulls out a toy, and the kids are out of the house in a second. And when we see these things enacted out, we feel them so much more deeply than if we're, this is why Aristotle is, for me, so much less an effective, just affects me much less than Plato does, because Plato's such a great dramatist, and the ideas that he presents have flesh and blood, and they walk around, and we can see them in the context of our own lives. Things are always easier to understand by analogy.
So if you're talking about ethics, you would prefer Dostoevsky or Plato over Aristotle? Yes,
I would. And it's because, it's because I'm a novelist and not a philosopher. Things are always more palatable to me if they're sort of presented in an entertaining form.
Yeah, that was also one of the questions I had. You studied philosophy when you were at Bennington College. What is it that made you become a writer? Is that because you think you can have more effect by writing a novel than by writing an academic treatise on ethics or moral philosophy? If
I had written an academic treatise, nobody would want to read it. It would be completely uninteresting.
Well,
I have nothing.
Well written.
Well, I studied philosophy because I wanted to be a writer. Writing really came first. This was what I wanted to do. Because I'm young. I'm 28. I don't have any great truths to tell anybody that everybody in this room doesn't already know. Like a lot better than I do. I don't have any special.
But you have a story.
But yes, a story, and that's and the reason that it was interesting for me to study philosophy, because the great problem of young novelists is that they are young, and novelists really need a lot of experience before they're able to write, have to know a lot about the world and how people interact and things like that. There are no child prodigies in novel writing, and I think it's really arguable that there are no great novels written by anyone under 40.
Well, this is probably a good time for interaction of the public. Are there any novels written before 40?
People always have examples, but either I haven't read them or I don't think they are.
This is not a good question for public interaction, I guess. Talking about literature, who are your greatest literary examples? We know a little bit about Scott Fitzgerald, not only because you write a little bit like Scott Fitzgerald, but also because in the book, Richard Papen's favorite novel is The Great Gatsby, and he sees all kinds of parallels between his life and The Great Gatsby. Is Scott Fitzgerald one of your literary examples?
Scott Fitzgerald is somebody I just love to read, return to his books with pleasure over and over again. So, yes, I love him very much, and there are books perhaps that I love less that I've learned more from, just in sort of a technical sense. But in terms of, sort of the real sort of emotional part of writing and what one responds to oneself. What one enjoys reading when one's sick and bad. Very, very much. I love Scott Fitzgerald.
Are there any authors who had a great influence on your writing? So not just for reading, but on your writing?
Yes, a great many of them. Dickens is a great writer for a young novelist to study, because there's almost no problem that Dickens is unafraid to handle. No technical problem. He really just does everything. And if you think of a specific example of something that's difficult to do, you can always, if you think over Dickens, you can think of an example where he was faced with the same problem and, of course, did it beautifully. So he's a great teacher, and also, just a very sort of benevolent presence. Some writers, I think it was John Irving who talked about, that it was bad for young writers to become overly obsessed with great figures of the past, and he used this wonderful line, the ghost of the young James Joyce standing horribly at your back,
looking over your shoulder.
Yes, which of course you'd never want to write again. But this is what I mean, that Dickens is a very benevolent presence, because you don't get that you don't get that feeling from him. He's kind of
nice grandfather.
Yeah, he is. He's very nice. He's very grandfatherly. He's like, okay, good try. Try again. Not like Joyce, who just.
Or T.S. Eliot, for that
Or
matter.
T.S. Eliot, I know, who just strike one dumb for the rest of one's life. I mean, just,
So that's the reason why you put him on your answering machine.
And it works. It works. They hang up. They don't call back.
A few questions on your Southern inheritance. You were born and raised in the deep South,
Yeah.
Mississippi, the country of William Faulkner. That's the first person we think of.
We too, yeah.
Well, Mark Twain is a good one too, of course.
But in Mississippi,
Yes,
Uncle
well, he was
Bill,
higher,
that's Uncle Bill's country.
Yeah.
And-
Did your native, well, the South has a very, very strong literary tradition, perhaps even stronger than the North or the West or the East.
I think very much so. I mean, definitely. I mean, that's, yeah.
And did your native region influence your writing very much? You wouldn't call yourself a Southern writer, but you are a writer from the South.
You know, Oscar Wilde, for instance, is not really an Irish writer. He never writes about the old sod or, you know, County Clare or anything like that, or digging potatoes out in the yard. But
Starving.
But he's just an Irishman through and through and through and through. His humor, his way of telling a story, his extravagance, you know, his teasing, jocular tone. He just is Irish. Just his temperament, even though he doesn't choose to write about Ireland, he's so Irish. Yet he didn't ever write about Ireland.
Mm-hmm. He was a sort of would-be Englishman, you would say.
Well, in a way, yeah, he was, you know, but he wasn't English at all in terms of temperament, or at least the English would wish to have you think so.
Yeah, that's true. So you're a sort of Southern writer in the way he is an Irish writer?
Well, this is something that Flannery O'Connor said, because people are always asking about, you know, if you're a Southerner and you're a writer, people always ask you, you know, aren't you oppressed by the ghost of William Faulkner? Like, you know, and the answer is no. I mean, no more than I'm oppressed by, say, the ghost of Joseph Haydn, you know? I'm glad that he's there. He wrote some great music. I'm not oppressed by this at all. But somebody asked Flannery O'Connor the same question, and how could, you know, this very long, involved question, you know, how could she possibly have anything new to say about the South? Because it had been, basically, this is a country that belongs to a master, and who had, you know, basically said all there was to say. And, you know, what could she, Flannery, possibly add? And she just said, you know, well, you know, you get off the tracks when the Dixie Special comes through, you know.
So you don't think you will ever write a book about the glorious pre-Civil War past, or race relations, or anything that's typically Southern?
Well, it's possible. Anything is possible. Actually, my new book is set in the South. Mm-hmm. The South now is a very, very different place than it was when William Faulkner was writing about it. I mean, there's a whole school of sort of new Southern writing that, you know, we're faced with a whole different set of problems now than William Faulkner had to deal with. I think William Faulkner would be pretty shocked if he walked through Oxford, Mississippi today and saw what, you know, it's very different.
What do these writers deal with then?
I mean, race relations have changed just dramatically in the course of my own lifetime. I mean, when I was a little girl, I can remember very clearly, you know, separate entrances at the hospital even, you know, a colored entrance, you know, things like that. You know, schools were segregated. It was a very different place than it is now, you know, because that's certainly not at all the case now. And I think it's really arguable that, you know, the American South has such a reputation, and rightfully so, of being, so full of prejudice and hatred. I mean, Walker Percy called it dark, bloody, mad old Mississippi. But in America now, in the Northeast and in Los Angeles, people are now dealing with problems that Southerners had to deal with maybe, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, because, you know, the racial crimes that are now happening in America are not happening in Birmingham, they're not happening in Jackson, they're happening in Los Angeles, and they're happening in New York, because the South, in a funny way, has worked through this. We have a terrible history, a terrible, unforgettable history of racial violence, but it's something that both sides have really learned to live with. And it's a much newer problem, I think, for other parts of the country.
Next is a question which is from the audience. Well, in your book there is not much of these directly Southern themes, but there's a lot of Gothic in the story. Horrible things that happen, although they usually happen off stage. Is Edgar Allan Poe a big influence on you? He's sort of the founder of the Gothic mode in America.
Oh, Edgar, you can't beat him with a stick. He's great. I love him.
You read him before bedtime.
Sometimes I do. Actually, Edgar Allan Poe is very fun to read when you're sick, because
You get sicker.
You get sicker. You do get sicker. It's just very much an influence. And also, he's another writer who I just kind of instinctively love. I mean, just someone I'm very drawn to, just on a very personal level. I mean, someone whose books I really enjoy reading to amuse myself.
Well, this will take a sort of sorting out, because some of the questions I took in my own interview, but now I have to really deal with the questions that are on this table. First one is, hi, I'd like to know in which way you got the idea for your story, and why did you choose this subject?
Well, that's really hard, because it changed over the course of, because I worked on this book for 8 years, and it changed during the writing so many times. 5, 6, 7 years into the writing, I would see a film or read something that I hadn't read before that really would kind of change everything that had gone before. So it wasn't as if I had the whole idea. I had an idea of the plot structure, just the very basic skeleton of this, that it would be about some young people committing a murder and sort of the consequences, but I didn't have just this huge idea in my mind when I began. It began very sketchily and kind of built up over a period of time.
It was not a newspaper clipping or something like that?
No.
I took Greek at secondary school for 5 years, but I couldn't speak a Greek sentence to save my life.
This man sounds like a friend of mine.
But the question is, what do they teach you at American schools that makes such a difference that people can converse?
This is why we call it fiction. I mean, you know.
Some questions on the characters. Lots of questions that were put on the paper are about Julian, one of the central characters, not one of the students, but the master of the class in which all these hideous things are worked out. Well, the easiest question for me to begin with at this moment is, could you say a bit more about Julian's role in the story? Because at first he seems very strong and influential, but later on he just moves and he fades away.
Well, Julian in some way is in most ways is sort of the animating presence of this book. I mean, he's where it all begins, but the reason that he's a shadowy presence is that, I mean, it's very deliberate, because in the world of this novel, this is a novel where adults are either ineffective or absent or completely horrible. I mean, these are very young people you're talking about, and that are the protagonists of this book, and in every single one of them, I mean, 2 of them are actually even orphans. And Julian is really very much a moral neutral, but he's someone upon whom they all sort of project this desire for a father, and really kind of refuse very strongly to see. Something that I try to do throughout the book is because in the early parts of the book they speak so glowingly of Julian, and I try to give little clues to the fact that this is really not the case. The things that they're telling you about Julian don't quite coincide with the way that he behaves. Because if he loves them so much, why do they see him so little? He seems very unconcerned with they talk about how he loves them all the time, but he is very removed from their lives in a physical sense. And, he just looks the part. He looks like this wonderful, old, kindly, incredibly cultured gentleman. I mean, sort of the dream parent. It's the parent that you wish that you had, this sort of fairy godfather. And they're all kind of blind to his faults because of that. And that's why when when what happens with Julian happens, and it's such a terrible betrayal when it's just thrown in their face. I mean, what they've really refused to see again and again and have pushed it back, every single one of them with both hands repeatedly throughout the book.
And then he fades away.
Yes.
In an interview this week, one of the many interviews you gave, you told the interviewer that the characters in The Secret History are based on abstract ideas and principles. Could you say what the abstract idea behind the character of Julian is then?
When I was in college, I was actually when I was studying Dickens. There's a book called Authority by Richard Sennett, which is largely about it has nothing really to do with what we're talking about here. But the opening quote is, Sennett says that people are always attracted to authority figures whom they secretly do not feel to be legitimate. It's a book about dictatorship and about political power. I mean, it's a very hazy. It's not an abstract idea that it's not as if Julian stands for truth or some sort of very very simple sort of. I mean that was.
He's just a charismatic.
Yeah, a charismatic figure. I mean, frequently charismatic figures are very empty. I mean, charismatic figures are frequently all surface. There's nothing there, and that makes them more powerful. The fact that they are all surface, because you can project whatever you want to upon them. Everybody has different things that they want in different people, and the more sort of blank someone is, the more they're able to reflect back your own desires. Julian is described in the book as being like a mirror. He's very brittle, he's very shallow, but he creates this illusion of warmth and depth like a mirror does. Any emotion you throw at him, he throws right back at you, and you get the sense that and he really is just sort of imitating in a way, but you get the sense that he understands you perfectly, because he somehow is picking up what you want from him and throwing it back at you.
He would make a great dictator, I understand.
Well, at the end of the book, there's a story that Julian has gone off has been hired by a royal family somewhere in Africa, and which turns out to be a rumor, but they're all enchanted by this idea. Maybe he'll bring up, like Aristotle did, bring up a man who will conquer the world. They say, I don't know what I would be if Julian had got hold of me when I was 8 years old. So,
why did you choose to write the story from a male point of view, while you are obviously a female author?
Well, for a very technical reason. It was obvious to me from the outset that this book had to be told from the point of view of a first-person narrator. It was essential that one never know what the other characters are thinking. There couldn't be an omniscient viewpoint. You could never go into Henry's mind or into Julian's, because this is a novel of how the narrator is sort of gradually drawn into this and gradually fooled, and the reader should be fooled along with him. So I knew that I needed a first-person narrator, and the reason that I made the first-person narrator male was simply because the eyes of the narrator are the only pair of eyes that I have in the book. And
wouldn't a pair of female eyes?
No, they wouldn't have, because if you think about it, a character like Bunny, for instance, wouldn't have really been his real self around a woman. He would have been a very different character around. He would have behaved very differently towards a young woman who had joined the class and he would have been, I think, much less himself. I mean, I think he would have, restrained himself much more. I think he would have seen a better side of him that was probably less true. The same with Henry. I think that you just wouldn't have been able to see these characters as clearly as you would have from the point of view of a young man. And also, I didn't want to bring the question, if the narrator had been a young woman, there would have been, always the question, well, obviously there's some sexual attraction that she has to Henry or to Julian, and I didn't want to bring that in at all, because it's not. I mean, and if she had been a woman, that question would have been asked. It just would have been, and not necessarily something I wanted to concentrate.
You once called The Secret History a novel about repressed sexuality. Is that what it is?
In a lot of ways, it is. I mean. Yes, the sexuality in the book just kind of bursts out at these sort of weird points, and there's never a sex scene or anything like that. But I mean, in a way, that's what the Bacchae is about, just sort of repression. And, if you repress anything for too long, it will eventually kind of come out in some way you're not expecting it and don't want it to. I think it's no accident at all that, serial killers, civilians, not kings and queens, who sort of went around killing people. The first time that we see these are in Victorian England. This is the first time that
society.
Yes, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It wouldn't have been so much fun for Dr. Jekyll to turn into Mr. Hyde had he not lived in Victorian England. Do you know what I mean? He could have just been Dr. Jekyll and gone out and done these things, and no one would care.
Much easier. And there are two questions about the names in the book. The first one is it mere coincidence that Henry, the evil one, is named after Lord Henry from the picture of Dorian Gray?
Well, it is coincidence, but it's an interesting question because, something else that this book is, concerned with is sort of the ideal of the dandy, sort of the self-centered one. One of the characters, I think the friend, not Dorian, but Dorian's friend says of Lord Henry Wotton, he never says a right thing and he never does an incorrect thing. He's, the persona of the dandy is very controlled and very, very stylized and, very sort of kabuki-like, unreal presence. And that's what these young people are trying to, or Henry in particular, is moving towards, but is kind of unable to get at. Julian is a perfect example. Julian is very like Lord Henry Wotton, who's also a moral neutral and in the book, in the picture of Dorian Gray.
The other one is Bunny, whose nickname, I guess, has associations with the writer and critic Edmund Wilson from, I think it's the 30s of this century. The fact that Bunny's real name is Edmund Corcoran, strengthens the association. Is there any connection, or is it an homage to Edmund Wilson?
Well, it's not, but it's an interesting point to bring up anyway. Because I don't like Edmund Wilson, and we almost always disagree invariably. So maybe it's some unconscious thing.
Well, then there's a so-called short and simple question, and that is, are you Bunny?
I wouldn't be here if I was.
She wouldn't be there because Bunny dies. It's not a spoiler. You learned that at the start of the book. There's also more of that conversation and a reading from The Secret History on our YouTube channel, and I'll link to that in the show notes. That was a conversation with Donna Tartt way back in 1993 at the Kleine Comedie. Did you know that we also have a newsletter you can sign up for and a veritable treasure trove of great American thinkers and speakers at john-adams.nl, john-adams.nl. And while you're there, why not become a member of the John Adams? Not only will you support what we do, you get a discount to future live events. In the meantime, you should go to wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review of this show. This will help get the word out, and we can keep on sharing the very best of American thinkers in Europe with you, free of charge. That's it for this week's show. Our theme song is called La Prensa by the Parlandos. Our editor is Tracy Metz. From Amsterdam, this was Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute. I'm Jonathan Gruber. Thank you for listening.